SAR officers, what are the scariest stories you have? I've been an SAR officer for a few years now, and along the way I've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. Story 1. I have a strong track record for finding missing people. Most of the time, they simply wander off the path, slip down a small cliff, and can't find their way back. The majority have heard the old stay where you are advice, so they don't stray far. However, I've had 2 cases where this didn't apply. Both cases haunt me, and they fuel my determination to work even harder on every missing persons case I get. The first involved a little boy who went berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both disappeared around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for just a few seconds, and in that short moment, both kids apparently wandered off. When the parents couldn't find them, they called us and we began searching the area. We found the daughter fairly quickly. When we asked where her brother was, she told us that he'd been taken by the bear man. She said he had given her berries and told her to stay quiet because he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last thing she saw was her brother riding on the shoulders of the bear man, looking calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found any sign of another human being in the area. The little girl was insistent that he wasn't a normal man. She described him as tall, covered in hair, like a bear, and with a weird face. We searched that area for weeks. It was one of the longest searches I've ever been part of, but we never found a single trace of the boy. The second case was a young woman hiking with her mom and grandfather. According to her mother, the girl had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, but she never came back down. The family waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name, before they finally called for help. We searched everywhere, but we never found a single clue. I can't imagine where she could have gone, especially since neither her mother nor her grandfather saw her climb down. Story 2. A few times I've been out on my own with a canine during searches, and the dog has led me straight to the base of cliffs. Not hills, not steep inclines, sheer vertical cliffs with no handholds at all. It's always baffling, and in those cases, we usually find the missing person on the other side of the cliff or miles away from where the canine first led us. I'm sure there's a logical explanation, but it never fails to feel strange. Story 3. One particularly sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and was impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what had happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance and let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It sounded as if her whole world was collapsing, and a part of her died with her daughter. I later heard from another SAR officer that she took her own life a few weeks later. She couldn't bear the loss of her child. Story 4. I was partnered with another SAR officer because we had reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a climber who hadn't returned home when expected. We ended up scaling some tough terrain to reach the area where we believed he might be. We found him trapped in a narrow crevasse with a broken leg. He'd been there for nearly 2 days, and his leg was clearly infected. We managed to get him airlifted out, but I later heard from an EMT that the man was inconsolable. He claimed that when he reached the summit, he saw a man without any climbing gear, dressed in a parka and ski pants. The man turned around and his face was completely blank. No features at all. Terrified, the climber rushed to descend the mountain, panicked, and fell. He said he spent the night hearing the faceless figure climbing down and letting out muffled screams. That story stuck with me. I'm just glad I wasn't there to witness it. Story 5. One of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had involved searching for a young woman who had gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out late at night because the dogs had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large rotted log, missing her shoes and pack, clearly in shock. She had no visible injuries, and we managed to convince her to walk back to base with us. On the way back, she kept glancing over her shoulder and asking why the big man with black eyes was following us. None of us saw anything, so we assumed it was some kind of hallucination caused by shock. As we got closer to base, her anxiety increased. She started begging me to make him stop making faces at her. At one point, she turned around and began screaming into the forest, saying she wouldn't go with him and that she wouldn't let him take us either. We managed to calm her down and keep moving, but soon we began hearing strange noises around us. It sounded like rhythmic, deep coughing, almost insect-like. As we neared the base, she turned to me with wide, terrified eyes, touched my shoulder, and said, "He says to tell you to hurry up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck." I have a small scar on the base of my neck, usually hidden by my collar, and I have no idea how she could have seen it. Moments later, I heard the coughing sound right in my ear. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I hurried her to the base, trying not to show how unsettled I was, and I was relieved to leave the area that night. Story 6. This is the last story I'll share, and it's probably the strangest one I have. I don't know if this happens in every SAR unit, but in ours, it's almost a routine occurrence. If you ask other SAR officers about it, they might know what you're talking about, but they probably won't say much. We've been instructed by our superiors not to discuss it, and by now we've gotten so used to it that it feels normal. Whenever we're deep in the wilderness, 30 or 40 miles in, it's not uncommon to find a staircase in the middle of the woods. They look like they've been cut out of someone's house and dropped there, perfectly intact. The first time I saw one, I asked about it, and my partner just told me not to worry and that it was normal. Everyone I've asked has said the same thing. I once wanted to check one out up close, but I was firmly warned not to go near it. Now I just ignore them when I come across them, which happens more often than you'd think. Story 7. There's been a lot of people pointing out similarities between some of my stories and those shared by David Polides. I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to copy him in any way. I have the utmost respect for the guy. In fact, he's part of what inspired me to write these stories because I can confirm that many of the strange cases he talks about really do happen. We encounter numerous bizarre missing persons cases, and most of them remain unsolved. Either that, or we find people in places they have no logical way of reaching. I haven't personally worked on too many cases like that, but I'll share a few I've experienced, and one a friend told me that relates to this. Story 8. There's been a lot of curiosity about the stairs, so I'll touch on that briefly and include a related story. The stairs come in various shapes, sizes, styles, and conditions. Some are old and crumbling, while others look brand new. I once saw a set that seemed like they were from a lighthouse, metal, spiral, and old-fashioned. They don't extend infinitely or vanish into the sky, but some are taller than others. Imagine the stairs in your house, as though someone cut them out and dropped them in the middle of the woods. I don't have pictures. After my first attempt to take some, I never tried again. I didn't want to risk my job over it. I might attempt it again in the future, but I can't make any promises. Story 9. Some people were confused about the story of the climber and the man with no face, so I want to clarify. When the climber reached the summit, he encountered another man standing there. This man was wearing a parka and ski pants, but he had no face, just a blank, featureless surface where his face should have been. Apologies for the confusing wording in the original story. I'll try to avoid that in the future. Storytime. Missing persons make up about half of the calls I receive. The rest are rescue missions for people who've fallen, gotten injured, or encountered wild animals. Our team is excellent at tracking and finding lost individuals, which makes cases where we find nothing all the more frustrating. One such case stands out because we did find something, but it only raised more questions. An older man went hiking alone on a well-used trail. His wife called us when he didn't return, mentioning that he had a history of seizures and might have forgotten to take his medication. We set out to search, and one of our experienced trackers quickly found signs that he had gone off trail. We spread out in a fan formation to cover more ground, but soon a call came over the radio asking us to regroup. When we arrived, the tracker was standing at the base of a tree, holding his head in disbelief. He pointed up, and we saw a walking stick hanging from a branch about 30 feet above the ground. The strap on the handle had been looped over the branch, leaving the stick dangling. There was no way the man could have thrown it that high, and we found no other signs of him nearby. We called out, but it was clear no one was in the tree. It felt like a cruel joke. We brought in the dogs, but they lost his scent long before the tree. After days of searching, we had to call it off. The man's wife called us every day for months, asking if we had found him. It was heartbreaking to hear her hope fading over time. To this day, we still talk about that case. How did his cane get there? Was someone else involved? The sheer improbability of it was deeply unsettling, and it's a mystery that still haunts us. Story 11. Missing kids are the most heartbreaking cases. It doesn't matter the circumstances under which they disappear. It's never easy, and finding them deceased is something we all dread. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it stays with you. David Polides often talks about kids being found in places they shouldn't or couldn't be, and while I've heard of cases like that, I've only witnessed a few myself. One of those cases still haunts me. A mother and her 3 young kids were out for a picnic near a small lake. Her children were 6, 5, and 3 years old. She kept a close eye on them the entire time, and she was certain no one else was in the area. When it was time to leave, she packed up and started walking back to the parking lot. The trail was well established, only 2 miles long, and nearly impossible to get lost on unless you deliberately went off the path. The kids were walking ahead of her when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around to look, and in the few seconds she wasn't watching, her 5-year-old son vanished. She thought he might have stepped off the trail to pee, so she asked her other 2 kids if they had seen where he went. Both of them said, "A big man with a scary face came out of the woods, took their brother's hand, and led him into the trees." Strangely, neither child seemed upset. The mother later described them as dazed, almost as if they had been drugged. Panicking, she began calling for her son and searching nearby, but she couldn't find him. At one point, she thought she heard him call back to her, but she couldn't risk leaving her other 2 children to search deeper in the woods. She called the police, and our team was dispatched immediately. We searched for weeks, covering miles of forest, but we didn't find a single trace of the boy. The canines couldn't pick up his scent, and there were no signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no broken branches, nothing. At first, there was suspicion about the mother, but it was clear she was devastated by the ordeal. Eventually, the official search was called off, but volunteers continued looking. One day, we got a call saying a body had been found. The location didn't make sense. It was 15 miles from where the boy had disappeared. We assumed it had to be a different child, but when we arrived, it was him. A volunteer had been searching an area others wouldn't think to check when he spotted something halfway up a steep, rocky slope. Using binoculars, he saw the bright color of the boy's shirt in a small crevice. He immediately called it in, and we were dispatched to recover the body. It took us nearly an hour to retrieve him because the slope was so treacherous, even with our climbing gear. There was no way a 5-year-old could have climbed up there alone. What's even stranger is that the boy's body showed no signs of injury. His shoes were missing, but his feet were clean and undamaged. He hadn't been dragged by an animal, and there was no evidence to suggest how he had ended up there. Even more unsettling was the fact that the boy appeared to have been dead for only a day or two, despite being missing for over a month. The coroner later confirmed he had died from exposure, freezing to death late at night 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects, no evidence, and no answers. To this day, it remains one of the most baffling and disturbing cases I've ever encountered. It still keeps me up at night, trying to piece together how that little boy ended up where he did. Story 12. One of my first assignments as a trainee was a search operation for a 4-year-old boy who had gotten separated from his mother. This was one of those cases where we were confident we'd find him because the dogs had picked up a strong scent trail and there were clear signs he was still in the area. We eventually found him in a berry patch about half a mile from where he'd last been seen. The boy had no idea he'd wandered that far. One of the veteran team members took him back, which I was grateful for. I'm not great with kids and find it hard to keep them calm or entertained. As my trainer and I were heading back, she suggested we take a detour so she could show me one of the hot spots where missing people are often found. It was a natural dip in the landscape near a popular trail, and she explained that people tend to move downhill because it's easier. The spot was a few miles away, so it took us about an hour to get there. While we were walking around the area and she was pointing out notable locations where she'd recovered people in the past, something caught my eye in the distance. The area was about 8 miles from the main parking lot, though there were back roads that could get you closer. It was state-protected land, meaning no commercial or residential buildings were allowed. Occasionally, you might come across a fire tower or an abandoned makeshift shelter, but this was different. From where I stood, I could tell whatever it was had sharp, straight edges, something nature doesn't typically produce. I pointed it out to my trainer, but she didn't respond. Instead, she hung back and let me approach it alone. As I got closer, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It was a staircase, just a normal staircase, about 10 steps high, covered in beige carpet. But it wasn't attached to anything. It was just standing there in the middle of the woods. The sides were unfinished wood, as if they had been plucked from a house and dropped into the wilderness. It reminded me of a glitch in a video game where a house fails to load, leaving only a staircase floating in space. I stood there staring at it, while my brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. My trainer eventually walked up beside me, her expression casual, as if she saw this kind of thing all the time. I asked her what the staircase was doing there, and she chuckled. "Get used to it, rookie. You're going to see a lot of them." I started moving closer, but she grabbed my arm, hard. Her voice was calm, but her grip was firm. "I wouldn't do that," she said. "You're going to see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them. Don't go up them. Just ignore them." I wanted to press her for more information, but something in her tone and the look in her eyes told me it was better not to ask. We moved on, and she never brought it up again during my training. She was right, though. About every fifth call I go on, I come across a set of stairs. Sometimes they're close to the trail, within 2 or 3 miles. Other times they're 20 or 30 miles deep into the wilderness, only found during wide-scale searches or training exercises. They're usually in good condition, but occasionally they look ancient, as if they've been weathered by time. I've seen all kinds. Small, narrow staircases, grand staircases that look like they came from a mansion, and even metal, spiral stairs that remind me of old lighthouses. The largest one I've seen was at least 10 feet wide and rose 15 or 20 feet high. I've tried bringing them up with colleagues, but I always get the same response. "It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're not a big deal, but don't go near them or up them." Now, when trainees ask me about them, I give them the same answer my trainer gave me. I don't know what else to say. I'm still hoping that one day I'll get a better explanation, but so far that hasn't happened. Story 13. This one wasn't spooky, just profoundly sad. A young man went missing late in the winter, during a time when most people have no business being out on the trails. While many of the trails are closed in winter, some remain open year-round unless there's an overwhelming amount of snow. That year, we had about 6 feet of snow on the ground. It was an unusually heavy snow season, and we knew the chances of finding him before spring were slim. We conducted a search operation but came up empty-handed. We assumed we wouldn't locate him until the thaw. Sure enough, when the first big thaw came, a hiker reported finding a body just off the main trail. We responded and found the young man at the base of a tree, lying in a hollow where the snow had melted. I immediately knew what had happened, and it terrified me. For those who ski, snowboard, or spend time on mountains, you might already know where this is going. When snow falls, it doesn't accumulate as densely under the branches of trees, especially fir trees, which have a closed, umbrella-like shape. This creates a hollow space at the base of the tree, filled with loose, powdery snow, air, and branches. These are called tree wells, and they're deceptively dangerous if you don't know how to recognize them. We put up large warning signs at the Welcome Center every winter, urging visitors to be cautious of tree wells. But every year with heavy snowfall, at least one person ignores the warnings or doesn't take them seriously. Tragically, this young man was one of them. My best guess is that he was hiking, became tired, or got a cramp from trudging through the deep snow. He likely went to sit at the base of a tree, not realizing there was a tree well beneath it. He fell in, feet up, and the snow collapsed around him. Unable to free himself, he suffocated. It's a phenomenon called snow immersion suffocation, and while it's rare, it can happen in deep snow, especially if you end up in an awkward position like he did. Even 6 feet of snow can be lethal under those circumstances. What haunts me most is thinking about how he must have struggled. Upside down in freezing temperatures, he didn't die quickly. The snow would have packed in around him, dense and heavy, making it impossible to escape. As he struggled to breathe, he would have understood exactly what was happening. I can't begin to imagine the terror and desperation he must have felt in his final moments. Story 14. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends often ask if I've ever encountered something like the Goatman during my calls. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, I've never experienced anything quite like that. The closest thing was the black-eyed man story, but I didn't actually see anything myself. However, there was one call that felt vaguely similar, though I wouldn't go so far as to attribute it to something like the Goatman. We received a report about an older woman who had fainted along one of the trails and needed help getting back down. When we arrived, her husband was frantic. He jogged over to us and explained that he had been a little way off the trail when his wife suddenly started screaming. By the time he ran back, she had fainted. We placed her on a backboard and began carrying her down to the Welcome Center. On the way, she regained consciousness and started screaming again. I managed to calm her down and asked her what had happened. What she told me was strange enough to stick in my mind. She explained that while waiting for her husband, she began hearing a strange sound. At first, she thought it was a cat, but something about it was off. Curious, she moved a little ahead to get a better listen, and the sound seemed to be coming closer. The closer it got, the more uneasy she felt. Then she realized what was wrong. It wasn't a cat. It was a man saying the word meow over and over. Just meow, meow, meow. But it wasn't a man. It couldn't have been, because I've never heard a man make his voice buzz like that. I thought my hearing aid was malfunctioning, but it wasn't. I adjusted it, and the sound was still buzzing. It was awful. He was getting closer, but I couldn't see him. And then the last thing I remember was a shape coming out of the trees. I guess that's when I fainted. Naturally, I found this bizarre. Who would be out in the woods chanting meow at people? After we got her down safely, I told my supervisor I wanted to go back and check the area. He gave me the green light, so I grabbed a radio and returned to the spot where she had fainted. I didn't see or hear anything at first, so I ventured about a mile further up the trail. Then as I was heading back, I decided to step off the trail to see if I could find any sign of where the sound might have come from. By this point, the sun was starting to set, and I wasn't keen on being out alone after dark. As I turned to head back, I heard it, a faint sound in the distance. I stopped and called out, but no one responded. The sound didn't grow louder or closer, but it was unmistakably the same, a monotone meow, meow, repeating over and over. As strange as it sounds, it reminded me of Ned from South Park, the guy with the electrolarynx. I tried moving toward the sound, but it seemed to stay at the same distance, almost like it was coming from all directions at once. Eventually, it just faded away, leaving me standing there alone in the woods. I returned to the Welcome Center and reported what I'd heard, but there were no further incidents, and I never heard that sound again, even when I went back to the area during daylight. I suppose it could have been some kid messing around, but the buzzing quality of the sound and the way it seemed to come from everywhere at once still give me chills. While this wasn't the scariest or most supernatural experience I've had, it was definitely one of the strangest. Whether it was some prankster or something else entirely, I'll never know. Story 15. This happened on one of my first cases after finishing training, back when I was still getting used to everything. I had been a volunteer before, so I had some idea of what to expect. But as an SAR officer, you handle all kinds of situations. Everything from lost hikers to medical emergencies like heart attacks or animal attacks. This call came in early one morning from a young couple who were on a trail by the lake. The husband was hysterical on the phone, and we could hear a woman screaming in the background. He begged us to come immediately, but he was so distraught that it was hard to understand what had happened. When we arrived, we saw the husband holding his wife, who was clutching something in her arms. She was screaming these guttural, almost animalistic cries, and the husband was sobbing uncontrollably. As soon as he saw us, he begged us to help them and pleaded for an ambulance. We explained that we couldn't drive an ambulance up the walking trail and asked if his wife needed help walking. Through his tears, he managed to tell us that it wasn't his wife who needed help. I went over to the wife, trying to figure out what was going on. She was rocking back and forth, holding something tight to her chest and wailing. As I got closer, I saw that whatever she was holding was covered in blood, and my stomach sank when I noticed the baby sling on her front. I gently asked her what had happened and tried to get her to let me see what she was holding. When I finally managed to pry her arms open, I saw that she was holding her baby, lifeless, with his head crushed on one side and scratches all over his little body. I've seen dead bodies before, but this hit me harder than I expected. I had to step back for a moment to compose myself. I called over one of the veteran officers, and when I told him it was a dead baby, he patted my shoulder and said he'd handle it. It took over an hour to get the mother to let go of the baby. Every time we tried, she would scream and beg us not to take him, insisting that he would be okay if we just left her alone and let her help him. Eventually, one of the vets managed to calm her down enough to take the child. We brought the body back to the medical area, and when the EMTs arrived, they confirmed what we already knew. The baby had died instantly from the trauma to his head. Later, I spoke to a nurse at the hospital who shared more details about what had happened. The couple had been walking on the trail with the baby in a sling. The baby started fussing, so the dad took him out to hold him while they looked out over a small gully by the path. The mother stepped up to stand next to him, but accidentally stepped on a loose patch of soil, lost her footing, and fell into her husband. The collision caused him to drop the baby, who fell about 20 feet into the gully, landing on the rocks below. The father climbed down to retrieve the child, but he had landed on his head and was already dead by the time his father reached him. The baby was only 15 months old. It was a freak accident, a tragic chain of events that led to the worst possible outcome. To this day, it remains one of the most heartbreaking calls I've ever been on. Story 16. I haven't encountered many animal bite cases as an SR officer, mainly because large animals in the area tend to avoid humans. While there are bears, sightings are extremely rare. Most of the wildlife we see are smaller animals like coyotes, raccoons, or skunks. However, one animal we encounter regularly is the moose. And let me tell you, moose are no joke. They're aggressive and unpredictable, and if you ever find yourself between a mother moose and her calf, you're in big trouble. One of the more amusing calls we received involved a man who was chased by an enormous male moose. The poor guy had managed to climb a tree to escape and was stuck there when we arrived. It took nearly an hour to get him down safely. Once he was back on solid ground, he looked at me and said, "God damn, them furs is big up close." It wasn't a scary incident, but it still makes us laugh whenever we think about it. Story 17. This is, without a doubt, the scariest experience I've had on the job. It's also the one that made me seriously question whether I was cut out for this line of work. I've tried to forget it over the years because, as someone who spends most of their time in the wilderness, you can't let fear get the better of you. But this event still lingers in my mind. It happened in late spring during a typical lost child call. A 4-year-old girl had wandered away from her family's campsite and had been missing for about 2 hours. Her parents were beside themselves, insisting she would never wander off and that this was completely out of character for her. We assured them we'd do everything we could to find her and spread out in a standard search formation. I was paired with a good friend, and we chatted casually as we searched. As cold as it might sound, you become somewhat desensitized to these situations after doing the job long enough. You have to, or you'd never make it through. We searched for about 2 hours, going farther than we initially thought she might have gone. As we emerged from a small valley, both of us stopped abruptly. It was like the air had changed. My ears popped, and I felt a strange sensation, almost as if we had dropped several feet in an instant. I turned to my buddy to ask if he'd felt it too. But before I could speak, the loudest sound I've ever heard erupted around us. It was like a freight train passing directly over us, but the sound came from everywhere. Above, below, and all around. My buddy yelled something to me, but the noise was so deafening that I couldn't make out a word. We frantically looked around, expecting to see something, anything that could explain the noise, but there was nothing. My first thought was a landslide, but we weren't near any cliffs, and the ground beneath us was stable. The sound continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute. Then just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was eerie, but gradually the normal sounds of the forest returned. We radioed the rest of the team to see if anyone else had experienced the noise. Nobody had. Confused but unable to find an explanation, we shrugged it off and continued searching. An hour later, we still hadn't found any trace of the girl. By nightfall, most of the team had decided to call it a day, but my buddy and I chose to keep searching. The thought of a child alone in the dark woods was too awful to ignore. As we made our way back to the rendezvous point around midnight, my buddy suddenly stopped and shined his flashlight into a cluster of dead trees off the trail. He asked me to be quiet and listen. In the distance, we heard faint crying. It sounded like a child. We called out the girl's name, but there was no response, just the sound of sobbing. We followed the noise into the deadfall, calling her name repeatedly. The closer we got, the more uneasy I felt. Something wasn't right. Finally, it hit me. The crying was on a loop, the same hitching sob, wail, and hiccup repeated over and over, exactly the same each time. My buddy realized it at the same moment, and without saying a word, we both bolted back to the trail. I've never felt so terrified in my life. When we got back to the rendezvous point, we asked if anyone else had heard anything unusual, but nobody had. We never found the girl, and no trace of her was ever recovered. Of all the calls I've been on, this one haunts me the most. It was a complete disappearance. No body, no clues, nothing. And that strange, looping sound of crying, I'll never forget it. Story 18. We recovered the remains of a teenage boy nearly a year after he disappeared. All we found were the top of his skull, 2 finger bones, and his camera, located almost 40 miles from where he was last seen. Unfortunately, the camera was destroyed, offering no clues about what might have happened to him. Story 19. The body of a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome was found nearly 20 miles from where she had vanished. She had died of exposure about 3 weeks after going missing. Oddly, all of her clothes were intact except for her shoes and jacket. When the coroner conducted the autopsy, they found berries and cooked meat in her stomach, suggesting that someone had been taking care of her. Despite extensive investigations, no suspects were ever identified. Story 20. A 1-year-old baby's frozen body was found a week after he disappeared. He was discovered inside the hollow trunk of a tree, 10 miles from where he was last seen. The most unsettling detail was the fresh milk in his stomach, but his tongue was missing. The circumstances remain unexplained. Story 21. The remains of a 3-year-old girl consisted of a single vertebra and a kneecap, found in the snow nearly 20 miles from the campground where her family had stayed the previous summer. Her disappearance remains one of the most baffling cases we've encountered. Story 22. My buddy, who has been an SAR officer for about 7 years, shared his own experience with the mysterious stairs. During his first year, his trainer gave him the same warning I received: never go near, touch, or ascend the stairs. For the most part, he followed this rule, but curiosity eventually got the better of him. While searching for a teenage girl who had gone missing, the dogs had picked up a scent trail about 10 miles from the main path. My buddy had fallen behind the group when he spotted a pristine set of stairs off to his left. They looked like they belonged in a new house, with spotless white carpeting and no signs of dirt, leaves, or debris on or around them. The area was eerily devoid of animal or insect activity, but he didn't feel anything unusual as he approached. He touched the stairs, feeling the slight stickiness of the new carpet, and decided to climb them. Half of him expected something dramatic to happen, a portal to another dimension or a UFO to appear. But as he reached the top step, the only thing he felt was an overwhelming sense of wrongness. It was as if he'd entered a restricted area where he absolutely did not belong. The longer he stood there, the worse the feeling became. He also realized that the usual sounds of the forest had vanished, and even his own breathing was inaudible. Terrified, he climbed back down and rejoined the search without mentioning what he'd done. Later, when the search ended for the day, his trainer confronted him at the welcome center with an intense, almost angry expression. "You went up them, didn't you?" the trainer said. It wasn't a question. My buddy admitted it and asked how the trainer knew. The trainer only replied, "Because we didn't find her. The dogs lost her scent." When my buddy asked what that had to do with the stairs, the trainer demanded to know how long he'd been on them. My buddy said no more than a minute. The trainer gave him a cold, dead-eyed look and warned him, "If you ever go up another set of stairs again, you'll be fired immediately." The trainer walked away and has never answered any of my buddy's questions about the incident. My buddy has been involved in many cases where missing persons are never found or are found later in places they couldn't possibly have reached on their own. He confirmed that many of David Polides' accounts align with what SAR officers encounter. One story he told me that still stands out involved a 5-year-old boy with a severe mental disability. I'll share that one next. Story 23. This case involved a 5-year-old boy with both mental and physical disabilities who disappeared from a picnic area in late fall. His parents were adamant that he couldn't have just vanished. They explained repeatedly that it was impossible for him to wander off on his own. Someone must have taken him. Search teams scoured the area for weeks, going far beyond the usual search radius, but they found nothing. The dogs couldn't pick up his scent, not even in the picnic area where he was last seen. While suspicion briefly fell on the parents, it became clear they were devastated and had nothing to do with their child's disappearance. After about a month, the search was called off. As winter set in, most people, including the SAR team, had moved on. Months later, during a winter training exercise on one of the higher peaks, my buddy spotted something in the snow from a distance. When he got closer, he realized it was a shirt, frozen and partially sticking out of the snow. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to the missing boy, thanks to its distinctive pattern. About 20 yards from the shirt, he found the boy's body, partially buried in the snow. Despite being missing for nearly 3 months, the body appeared to have been dead for only a few days. The boy was curled around something, clutching it tightly to his chest. When my buddy brushed away the snow to see what it was, he was stunned. The child was holding a large chunk of ice that had been crudely carved to resemble a human figure. He was gripping it so tightly that his chest and hands had severe frostbite, which was still visible despite the decay. My buddy radioed the rest of the team, and they recovered the body. However, the circumstances surrounding the boy's death were baffling. There was no conceivable way this child could have survived on his own for almost 3 months, let alone traveled nearly 50 miles to the top of a mountain. Even stranger, the autopsy revealed that the boy had nothing in his stomach or intestines, not even water. It was as if he had been in some form of suspended animation, only to be placed on the mountain and left to die of exposure. My buddy has never been able to make sense of this case, and it's one that still haunts him to this day. Story 24. My buddy was out doing a recon for mountain lions after several sightings had been reported in recent days. Part of our job is to scout areas where these animals are spotted to ensure we can close trails and warn visitors if necessary. He was on his own in a densely forested part of the park around dusk when he heard what sounded like a woman screaming in the distance. For those unfamiliar, a mountain lion's scream can sound eerily similar to a woman being violently attacked. It's unsettling but not unusual. My buddy radioed back to ops to let them know he'd heard one and planned to continue scouting to locate its territory. As he moved through the woods, the mountain lion's scream echoed a few more times, always from the same general area. He was able to approximate the animal's territory and decided to head back before it got too dark. Just as he was about to turn back, another scream erupted, this time only a few yards away. Startled, he immediately began moving faster, not wanting to risk an encounter with the big cat. He got back on the trail and started jogging toward the welcome center. What unnerved him even more was that the screaming seemed to follow him. No matter how fast he moved, the sound stayed close, trailing him through the woods. By the time he was a mile away from ops, the screaming stopped. He turned around, trying to determine if he was being followed. The trail curved in the distance, and just before it rounded a corner, he noticed what looked like a male figure standing still. Thinking it might be a lost hiker, he called out to them, warning that the trails were closed and they needed to head back to the welcome center. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless. As my buddy approached, closing the gap to about 10 yards, the figure suddenly took what he described as an impossibly long step toward him. Then it let out the same piercing scream he'd been hearing all evening. Terrified, he turned and sprinted back to ops without looking back. By the time he reached the welcome center, the screaming had faded back into the woods. He didn't mention the figure to anyone, simply reported a mountain lion in the area, and recommended closing the trails until it could be located and relocated. Edit 2. KD's first story. KD is a veteran SAR officer with 15 years of experience, specializing in high-elevation mountain rescues. She's considered one of the best in her field and had plenty of stories to share. This one stood out, especially because it came up when I asked her about her most traumatic calls. Katie explained that really bad calls are more common in mountain rescues due to the increased risk of accidents. About 5 years ago, she was working in a park that experienced a string of disappearances during an unusually harsh winter. The weather was relentless, with about a foot of snow falling every couple of days, and several avalanches claimed the lives of climbers. Despite warnings to stick to mapped trails, some people ignored the advice, often with devastating consequences. In one particularly tragic case, an entire family was lost because the father decided to venture into an unsafe area. They were snowshoeing and, as best KD could deduce, walked onto what appeared to be a solid snow shelf. It collapsed beneath them, sending the family tumbling nearly 300 feet down a rocky slope. The parents and one of the children died instantly. Miraculously, 2 of the children survived the fall. One had a broken leg and fractured ribs, while the other was mostly unharmed, suffering only bruises and a sprained ankle. The uninjured child left their sibling behind to seek help, but didn't make it far. A storm overtook them less than half a mile from the accident site. They likely stopped to rest or warm up, but ultimately froze to death in the bitter cold. Witnesses who had seen the family heading into the wilderness helped SR teams locate them. KD was the one who found the child who had frozen to death while searching for help. She described the scene in heartbreaking detail. The snow was beginning to fall lightly, enough to obscure long-distance visibility, but not enough to make the search impossible. She spotted a small figure sitting upright in the snow ahead and rushed to it. As she approached, she realized it was a child. The child had succumbed to hypothermia in one of the most heartbreaking positions she'd ever encountered. He was sitting upright, knees tucked tightly against his chest, with his arms wrapped around them. His head was buried inside his coat for warmth. When KD gently moved the coat to check his face, she saw that he had died crying. His expression was frozen in anguish, with tears crystallized on his cheeks. As a mother herself, Katie admitted that this scene shattered her. It was painfully clear the child had been terrified in his final moments, overwhelmed by fear and cold. She spoke with raw emotion, saying repeatedly that she hoped the father, whose reckless decision had led to this tragedy, was burning in hell. Story 25. Another traumatic story KD shared happened during her rookie days. Her team received a report about an experienced climber who hadn't returned home the previous day. His wife, deeply concerned, insisted something terrible must have happened because her husband was always punctual and careful. The team began searching for him, climbing through sections of the mountain that were technically challenging and dangerous. They reached a relatively flat area when Katie noticed blood in the snow. She began following the trail, and as she went, she started seeing small pieces of tissue scattered along the path. At first, she couldn't identify what part of the body the tissue had come from, but the further she followed the trail, the more there was. The trail led her to a sheltered area beneath a cliff face, and there she found the climber. Katie described the scene as one of the bloodiest she'd ever encountered. The climber was lying face down in the snow, one arm stretched out in front of him as though he'd died crawling. Upon closer inspection, she saw he'd been partially disemboweled, which explained the tissue trail she'd been following. His ice axe, tucked into a hip holster, was covered in blood. While the exact sequence of events could never be confirmed, Katie pieced together what she believed had happened. The climber had been ascending to the next section of the mountain using his ice axe when he likely struck a loose patch and fell. On the way down, or possibly upon landing, he'd been impaled by the axe, which had disemboweled him. Despite his catastrophic injuries, he had dragged himself through the snow, unintentionally pulling pieces of his intestines out as he moved. He ultimately succumbed to his injuries beneath the cliff face. Katie admitted she isn't usually fazed by gore, but the scene was horrific enough to affect her. When her team arrived to help remove the body, several of them vomited after they turned him over, and a significant portion of his intestines spilled out. Story 26. When I asked KD if she had any stories about people completely disappearing, her eyes lit up. Leaning in, she asked, "Want to hear a real doozy?" She recounted a case from when she first started, one that gained significant media attention. A family had been out berry picking near the entrance of the park, an area that was well-trafficked and far from remote. They had two little boys, both under the age of 5. At some point during the day, one of the boys vanished without a trace. The search that followed was massive. Teams scoured the area for weeks, but there was nothing. No footprints, no scent for the dogs to follow, no physical evidence that the child had even been there. It was as if the boy had simply disappeared into thin air. After 2 months of fruitless searching, the operation was reluctantly called off. 6 months later, the family returned to the site to place flowers at a memorial they had set up for their lost son. They brought their other boy with them. While placing the flowers, they lost sight of him for no more than 3 seconds, and in that impossibly brief span, he vanished as well. The parents were beyond devastated, reeling from the incomprehensible loss of both children. The subsequent search was even larger than the first, with around 300 volunteers combing every inch of the park. Despite this monumental effort, no trace of the second boy was found. Then nearly 2 weeks later, a volunteer about 15 miles from the designated search area radioed in that he had found the missing child. Everyone assumed the boy would be dead, but the volunteer reported that he was alive and in good condition. KD and her team went out to recover the boy. When they arrived, KD was struck by how clean he was. His clothes were pristine, with no dirt or signs of wear, and he didn't seem traumatized at all. The volunteer explained that he had found the boy sitting calmly on a log, playing with a small bundle of twigs tied together with old rope. When KD gently asked the boy where he had been and who had taken care of him, he replied that he had been with the Fuzzy Man. Intrigued, KD, who firmly believes in Bigfoot, asked if the man was hairy. The boy said no. The man wasn't hairy. He was fuzzy, like when you squint your eyes but don't close them all the way. The boy described the Fuzzy Man as emerging from the trees and taking him deep into the woods. He said he had slept in a hollow tree and was given berries to eat. KD asked if the man was mean or if he had scared him, but the boy said no. He added, "I didn't like how he didn't have eyes." When they brought the boy back to headquarters, a police officer took him into town to learn more. The officer, a friend of KD's, later relayed what the boy had said. The boy described being kept in a hollow tree by the Fuzzy Man, who gave him berries when he was hungry. He was allowed to wander within a specific clearing, but if he tried to go further, The fuzzy man would get angry and yell. The boy said the yelling was strange because the fuzzy man didn't have a mouth. When the boy was scared at night, the fuzzy man would make it go brighter and gave him the twig bundle to comfort him. The boy also mentioned that the fuzzy man wanted to keep him, but had to let him go because he wasn't the right kind. He couldn't or wouldn't explain further. The police reopened the search for the first brother, but no new leads were ever found. The boy had no idea where his brother might be, and to this day, the older child remains missing. Story 27. The last story KD shared was a deeply personal and terrifying experience she had as a rookie. She had been with her training group, learning the basics of high-elevation belaying on a well-mapped side of the mountain. During a meal break, she needed to use the bathroom, so she walked about 50 yards away from the group. What followed was something she's never been able to fully explain. Here's how she described it to me. So I go to take a piss, and once I'm done, I start heading back to the group. But I've only gotten about 5 feet when I realize I have no idea where I am. And this wasn't just the usual, oh, I got turned around kind of lost. I mean, I had literally no clue where I was. If you'd asked me, I don't think I could have even told you what state we were in. It felt like how I imagine amnesia must feel. You're completely disoriented and nothing makes sense. I stood there for what felt like ages trying to figure out what the hell was going on. But the more I stood there, the worse it got. My thoughts just spiraled. Eventually, I started walking. Just picked a random direction and went for it. As I walked, everything got worse. I couldn't remember why I was on the mountain in the first place. It was like my entire purpose had been erased. I just kept trudging through the snow, completely lost in every way, when I started hearing this voice. It wasn't an actual voice, more like it was inside my head. It was low and croaky, like a frog talking, and it kept saying, it's okay, you just need to find something to eat. Find something to eat and you'll be okay. Eat, over and over like a mantra. And the hunger. I've never felt anything like it in my life. It was bottomless. I would have eaten anything. I had no concept of time, no idea how long I'd been wandering when I suddenly heard an actual voice in the distance. I started heading toward it and saw one of the other SAR officers running toward me, looking absolutely terrified. He was yelling, asking if I was okay and what the hell I was doing out there. The scariest part? As he got closer, I noticed myself reaching for my hunting knife. I wasn't even thinking about it. It was like my body was acting on instinct. All I could think was that I had to eat. If I didn't eat, I was never going to be okay again. He must have seen what I was doing because he stopped dead and yelled at me to put the knife away. He said, I'm not going to hurt you, just put the knife down. That snapped me out of it. All of a sudden, I knew exactly where I was. I shoved the knife back into its sheath and ran to him, asking how long I'd been gone. I thought he'd say half an hour, maybe an hour. But he looked at me and said, you've been gone for 2 days. 2 days. I'd crossed 2 peaks and was almost on the other side of the mountain. If I'd kept going, I would have ended up in about 300 miles of wilderness, and they never would have found me. He couldn't believe I wasn't dead. For me, no time had passed at all. It felt like I'd just gone to the bathroom and started walking. I didn't know what to say, so I followed him back to the rendezvous point, and they airlifted me to the hospital. The doctors ran every test they could think of. Their best guess was that I had some kind of weird fugue state, like amnesia, or maybe a seizure that temporarily scrambled my brain. But the truth is, no one really knows what happened. It's never happened again, but I've never gone out into the woods alone since. People joke about how I make them come with me when I leave the group, but I always tell them, listening to me piss in the snow is better than losing me for 2 days on a freezing mountain. KD's story gave me chills. She spoke about it matter-of-factly, but you could tell it still deeply unsettled her. It's a stark reminder of how unpredictable and disorienting the wilderness can be, and how even experienced SAR officers can be vulnerable to its mysteries. Story 28. EW, a former SAR trainer turned EMT, shared a chilling story with me over dinner during the training op. He's well regarded for his uncanny ability to locate missing children, but he's humble to a fault, brushing off compliments about his work. When the conversation shifted to strange calls, I mentioned the stares I'd heard about. That's when he got quiet and asked if I'd heard about a little boy who disappeared from his park a few years back. I hadn't, so he told me the story of Joey, an 11-year-old boy who went missing near a river. The search initially focused on the river, assuming Joey had fallen in and drowned. However, the dogs led the team away from the river into a densely forested area. What baffled them was how the scent trail behaved. In the grid pattern they used for searching, Joey's scent was only picked up in alternating squares. It was like a checkerboard. His scent appeared in some black squares but never in the red ones. EW and his partner entered a new section of the grid and spotted a set of stairs about 50 yards away. When EW suggested they check near it, his partner refused, saying he never went near the stairs and didn't pretend they were normal. Reluctantly, EW decided to check alone while his partner stayed within sight. The stairs were small, like ones leading to a basement. EW didn't feel any fear or unease as he approached. He, like many SAR officers, preferred not to dwell on the stairs' oddities. When he reached them, he noticed something curled up on the bottom step. His heart sank. He recognized the figure immediately. It was Joey, and he was clearly dead. The boy was curled into a fetal position, clutching his stomach. EW saw no visible injuries or blood, except for a trace on Joey's lips and chin. He radioed in the discovery, and the body was brought back to the command center. The family was devastated. Joey had only been missing a few hours, so his sudden death and the lack of an obvious cause were incomprehensible. EW suspected Joey had eaten something poisonous, but he avoided making assumptions or sharing his thoughts with the grieving family. A week later, EW got a call from a friend in the sheriff's department. The coroner had completed Joey's autopsy, and the results were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Joey's organs were riddled with quarter-sized holes, as if something had punched through them with perfect precision. His stomach, kidneys, colon, and even one of his testicles were affected. Yet there were no external injuries, no entry or exit wounds. The coroner likened it to a shotgun blast, but even that didn't fully explain the clean, precise nature of the damage. EW was at a loss. He had never heard of anything remotely similar and couldn't offer his friend any insights. The coroner ruled the cause of death as massive internal bleeding, but the case remained an unsolved mystery. EW admitted that this case haunted him. He left the SAR field partly because of cases like Joey's, saying he couldn't handle finding dead kids anymore, especially with the unexplained circumstances that often accompanied such cases. Before we parted ways that night, he placed a hand on my shoulder and gave me a grave warning. There are bad things out there, things that don't care if you have a family, a life, or feelings. Be careful. This story stayed with me as much for its strange details as for the way it visibly affected EW. It was a stark reminder that the wilderness is full of mysteries, some of which defy explanation. What's next? During the same training op, I had a chance encounter with another veteran, PB, who shared his own unsettling insights about the stairs and the other strange occurrences in the parks. I'll be sharing those in the next installment. Stay tuned, and thank you all for your continued curiosity and support. Story 29. A firefighter at the training op shared this disturbing story with me, detailing an incident where he was called to assist SAR officers in retrieving a child from a massive tree. The firefighter had previously worked as a tree trimmer, which is why he was specifically requested for the job. The SAR team led him about 2 miles into the woods, stopping at one of the largest trees in the area. The op captain pointed up into the branches and asked him to climb and retrieve the child. The firefighter, trying to lighten the mood, joked about how the kid had managed to climb such a tree, but the captain didn't respond and simply urged him to get started. As the firefighter began climbing, he started feeling uneasy. There was no way this kid should have been able to climb this fin thing, he said. It was massive at the base, and it tapered as it went up. I almost turned back a few times because I wasn't sure it would hold my weight. When he was nearing the top, he spotted a flash of blue, the child's shirt tangled in the branches. He called out to the boy, reassuring him that he was there to help, but got no response. Moving closer, the firefighter realized why. I found him, or what was left of him, cradled in the fork of a branch. The fact that he was even up there was pure luck. If he'd fallen differently, he would have come crashing down. Not that it would have mattered. That kid was long dead. What he saw next was horrifying. The child's intestines had burst out of his mouth and were draped over the branches like a grotesque decoration. The same had happened at the other end. His guts were spilling out from the bottom of his pants. His eyes were missing, likely displaced from the pressure that had forced his insides out. His swollen tongue protruded from his mouth, crawling with flies. It was like some sick Christmas tree, and he said, "I think I must have gone into shock. I broke a branch off the tree and used it to push the kid's body down. I didn't want to touch him. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't. The firefighter admitted he almost lost his job over his actions, but he couldn't imagine carrying the boy's mutilated body down the tree. The thought of gathering his guts, coiling them up so they wouldn't get snagged, it made me feel like I was going to lose my mind. When the child's body hit the ground, the firefighter expected the team to react, but they didn't. They already knew the boy was dead when they sent him up the tree. Back on the ground, the firefighter confronted the captain, furious that he'd been sent up without being told the child was deceased. The captain, however, calmly dismissed him, thanking him for retrieving the evidence. That word stuck with me, the firefighter said. Evidence. Like he wasn't a person. Like he wasn't a little kid who'd been lost and had something horrific happen to him. The captain and two others stayed behind while the firefighter was led out of the woods. When he asked why he wasn't helping transport the body, the SAR officers escorting him simply said they couldn't discuss an open case. When I asked the firefighter what he thought had happened to the boy, he paused for a long moment before answering. I would have guessed a crush injury, something that forces the internal organs out. But with crush injuries, you see massive contusions, obvious trauma. This wasn't like that. It was clean, almost surgical, like the kid had been caught in some kind of vacuum that sucked his guts out. But even then, there was no external damage. None at all. He shook his head, visibly disturbed. It bothers me, man. It bothers the hell out of me. Story 30. During the training op, one of the veteran SAR officers recognized my stories from no sleep. He pulled me aside to share his thoughts, particularly about the stairs and some of the stranger things he'd seen. I'm glad you're sharing these stories, he said. People need to know what's out there, especially since the Forest Service is doing everything they can to keep it under wraps. When I asked what he meant, he pointed out how little media attention these incidents receive, especially when it comes to missing kids or inexplicable deaths in the woods. He said it felt deliberate, a strategy to avoid scaring people away from the parks. Then he dropped something I hadn't heard before. Flipped stairs. You know about the regular ones, he said, but sometimes I've seen them upside down, like someone took a set of stairs, flipped them so the top step is buried in the ground, and left them in the woods. I was confused, having never encountered such a thing. He described the flipped stairs as eerier than the regular ones, comparing them to debris left standing after a tornado, like random chimneys or walls. They bother me more, he admitted, because I can't write those off. They feel wrong in a way I can't explain. The vet then shifted the conversation to the faceless man, clearly intrigued by the account I'd shared. He told me he'd encountered something similar during a training exercise a few years back. While camped out, he heard footsteps outside. Thinking it might be a rookie who had wandered off to pee, he got up to check. At the edge of camp, he saw a figure walking away into the woods. Concerned, he followed. I know it was stupid, he said, but I didn't want to deal with someone getting hurt. He followed the figure for about a mile until it stopped by a small river. The moonlight reflected off the water, and he could make out the outline of a person, a man with a pack, standing as though he were facing him. He called out to ask if the man was okay. The figure cocked its head but didn't respond. Thinking the man might be sleepwalking, the vet approached cautiously, turning on the small thumb light attached to his pocket knife. He shone the light on the man's chest to avoid blinding him and noticed the slow, exaggerated rise and fall of his breathing. It was too even, he said, too slow. It was like he was pretending to breathe but wasn't actually doing it. Feeling uneasy, he asked the man to identify himself. The figure made a muffled noise, and when the vet raised the light to its face, he froze.